So let's just start off. Let's dive straight in. It's more complex than I'd like, but it's kind of a complex topic. What does breaking out mean? So the first thing that we're really seeing is that conversational data is being demanded to fuel everything, right? This is a huge source of data. What are people saying? How do they feel about what they're saying? You know, sentiment, intent, all of these sorts of things. They go beyond that initial, I can help my customer out and understand what my customer wants to, well, okay, now I can analyze 100% of what my customers want. I can turn that into my marketing pipeline, my product pipeline, my sales pipeline. So that need for rich conversational data is pushing CCaaS products to find better ways of getting and sharing their data into other platforms. The other thing that we're starting to see is this demand for looping experts that are based elsewhere outside the CCaaS ecosystem into the CCaaS ecosystem to answer customer queries. I mean, that can be as simple as you have one expert accountant on a very niche area of a topic. You get one call a year about that topic, but that call is worth the most money of any call ever. You need to be able to get that person on the phone very quickly. You need to know when they're available. And you need them to be able to dial in a frictionless way because that call needs to be handled in a certain way with a certain speed, right? Now imagine that happens more than once a year and you start to see a use case being built for being able to find people outside your organization on different platforms, bring them into contact center interactions. And the other thing, of course, is that there is still a prevalence that customer conversations happen outside the contact center in whatever way your customer wants them to happen. So is it a quick WhatsApp message? Is it a call to your sales team? Is it an email to an email address that isn't, tied to or registered to the CCaaS ecosystem? And finding out how we're going to get that customer conversation to be tracked and then into that data landscape. So you can think, these are three ways where my CCaaS ecosystem needs to break out and be integrated in other ways. And to tie that back to the theme of today, because we're going to talk about the relevance of telephony and enablement into this ecosystem of gathering data, looping it all together, and having an integrated experience. So I want you to keep these three things in mind, these three demands, as we kind of go through both this session and, of course, the panel after it. So first, you've heard a lot today about the role of voice and declining seats and voice, but growing collaboration-enabled seats. But we can talk about voice in the contact center pretty definitively. We went and surveyed 500 agents in North America about their job and the impact of AI on their job. 80% still use voice as their top used channel every day. After that was email, and then after that was sort of a much, much less usage, around 20% of other channels like WhatsApp, social media messaging, all those kind of things. So that tells us that when it comes to how people are interacting with customers, voice is still the main way that they're interacting with customers. And then you ask them, okay, well, AI started to be deployed in the market. How has that impacted your interactions? 31% said voice interactions have increased in the last 12 months. Now, when we dig deeper into this, and there's a webinar out there on the Cavell website, you can get in touch with me. There's public where we dive into this a bit more. You'll see task complexity up, task volume up, all the metrics by which we judge how busy a contact center agent is are up. And a lot of those increase in complexity volume is happening over voice as well. And that is mirrored when you go and talk to all the vendors, as I have been doing. You ask them what the traffic is over their network. They say voice traffic, human to agent traffic, not automated voice traffic, is still on the rise, as well as an increase in automated traffic. So we have kind of a pretty clear tapestry there that tells us that voice is more and more relevant to the contact center every single year. And that has not yet been impacted by AI. But convergence is obviously something that is happening. And when we put together this slide originally, I think it had three groups of people on. We had the on-premise contact centers, we had the CCaaS people, and we had the UCaaS people starting to come together. And then we said, okay, but the point solution providers, they're integrating into contact center now as well. And then the CPaaS providers, they were doing some stuff in the contact center as well. We added them. And then the CRM and the infrastructure guys started doing contact center as well, so we added in them. And then this year we added in marketing software, people from service management solutions, and then a whole load of AI native startups. And really, the largest CCaaS deployment will have elements of all of these integrated into it. And that's kind of this picture of converged landscape that's happening. And the real impact for that on the space, because we're keeping this idea of needing more data, needing more integration, needing to follow that thread through the contact center to find the information on your customer interactions and conversations relevant to your customer is that while all these solutions do compete, they all actually also have to work together as well. And we've kind of had that narrative a bit already today across all of the enablement ecosystems about that increased need to work together to deliver the outcomes that our customers are expecting. And that is true, mostly driven, a lot by the data that's needed to fuel the automations that we're building. And again, I mean, looking at this from multiple angles, we talk about how the ecosystem is being forced to integrate. Then, of course, we have to turn to the question of, is integration a challenge that needs to be solved? And again, if we go back to that agent data and we ask people, okay, during a typical customer interaction, how many applications do you actually have to use? 17% are using 5+ different applications to deal with, the typical customer query. 57% using over 3 different applications. So then, of course, that question of, is my agent having a nice, calm day, or are every time the customer calls up, they're having to open 5 different things, flick through 5 different systems to try and just answer those customer questions? So is integration a problem? It very much is. And the very well integrated question is another interesting addition, because when we followed up on this and we said, okay, well, you've got all these apps, but do they work together? And we defined integration as, are they sharing data automatically? Is it self-populating? How much manual entry are you having to do? And quite a few people, I think about 70% came back and said there is some form of integration between a lot of these different applications. They're doing a bit of the work for me. But when you ask that question, are they very well integrated? Are they taking the entire burden off you? Well, no. And if you think about the larger contact centers, those with 1,000+ agents in, that number drops down to less than sort of 29%. So less than a third of agents working in those larger contact centers would say that their systems are working together in a way that makes their life easy. I think that's worth considering when we're thinking about integration as well. This slide I really like because I keep getting asked, where is the industry in terms of the AI journey? And again, it kind of follows through this narrative about increased demand for data to build the use cases that we're thinking of in the future. So we define sort of where simple automation and AI is being used, the reactive automation. So I ask it a question, it gives me an answer, it answers the FAQ, it handles, a bill payment, or, it does some sort of feed it some data, it summarizes that data and sends that back to me. Fairly easy to do. Being rolled out pretty consistently, starting to see a lot of use cases for that. Then you move into that idea of transactional, contextual. So not just can it understand when I feed it the exact type of data that it needs and it can spit something back out to me, but can it then act on that data? Can it then move forward with that data? Does it understand the context where we're having that discussion? So it knows that we're operating in a system where it can book appointments. And if I ask it to go and schedule an appointment with my doctor, it can do that. And that is kind of where the majority of the industry actually is in terms of practical deployments. We're seeing startups selling this into restaurants in America. We're seeing a lot of the vendors rolling out that sort of deployment. Then you have assistive and dynamic. So it doesn't just understand the system it operates in, it understands a lot of other systems. It has more access to knowledge databases. It can recommend what you should do. And then it can review large amounts of data and provide feedback, automated quality assurance, and you kind of put real-time translation in there as well because it requires a lot more access to data to do an accurate translation. And then on the very long tail, where I am seeing, the initial deployments and things being tested is that proactive outreach and retention, intelligent triage. These things that don't just require an understanding of the information being fed to the system, an understanding of the context where the system sits, but also sort of an understanding of the broader ecosystem, and then also powers of autonomy to make actions and decisions. And I mean, if you think about in terms of roadmap, where we are now, transactional, contextual, how long it's actually going to take the industry to get comfortable with predictive and autonomous automation, it could be quite a few years until we get to that point where it's deployed at scale. And here's a question that I really wanted to ask, and I think it is very relevant, is how many of these use cases actually require some sort of telephony enabled? And I think if we dive into them, you'll see that across all of them, voice could very easily, and telephony could very easily be the methodology by which either internally or the customer is accessing this use case. You know, even thinking about appointment booking, that makes more sense. You know, calling up a restaurant, getting your dinner booking in. But then you think about moving on to the more complex, you know, intelligent triage. So calling up, just spilling your heart out on the phone about a problem you're having, and then being correctly sorted, not just by your need and the problem you're having, but also your emotional state, the sentiment, and obviously who is best to deal with you. Proactive outreach and retention, the idea that we understand by looking at all of this customer data when the right time is to make a call to them to help them solve a problem that they might be having, right? If it's a sensitive issue, you're going to want to make a phone call, you're going to want to use telephony. So it's interesting to think when you're looking at how voice is going to fit into all of this. So then I want to get into sort of the meat of this in terms of working with experts beyond the contact center. And I really want to break down sort of where the industry is and where the industry's kind of going. And I think a lot of interactions still fit this pattern. The customer calls up a contact center agent. They need a bit of additional help. The interaction either stops or goes on pause while the agent goes and finds out how we're going to help them or transfers them. Contact center agent calls an expert who isn't in the contact center, then goes back to the customer, asking for more information, repeat as many times as you need, and the interaction takes as long as it wants. But this is not really where we want to be. So we think about a more integrated system and what that might look like. The customer calls up the contact center, they need more help. The contact center agent understands where the expert is, whether they're available, which is the right expert to bring into the call, and what's an efficient use of that expert's time, dials them into the call, and then together they solve the customer query at speed. Right, now that is kind of like a dream scenario, but it is one that I have heard is something that, certain industries where there are high-value experts, things like accountancy, tax, law, who are not ever going to be within the contact center ecosystem because it does not make sense to have your expert in a certain type of accounting being near a queue or on a queue. They're not going to be taking the majority of calls, but they are incredibly relevant to a small subset of calls that are happening on your network, and understanding where those calls are and bringing them in is a very high-value use case. But there are a lot of questions that come up when you think about this kind of integrated telephony-enabled CCaaS workflow. So you need to know, are they online at all? Can they take calls? Are they in another meeting? Is that something that would disrupt their day too much? You need to understand where they are in their workflow. Are they in the middle of another big project? Can they be made available? You need to give them data to understand actually what's happening in the call that they're being dialed into. It's not their job to join the call and then have to talk for 10 minutes with the customer to understand the problem, right? You can and you should be providing that information to them. And then what's also interesting as well is you have to account for the time that they have spent with you, right? So you need to be able to report back to the manager of that person, well, yeah, they spent 3 hours on the phone today dealing with customer issues via the contact center ecosystem. You're not going to measure them the same way a CCaaS agent is measured in terms of average handle time, call resolution, any of those CCaaS metrics. So to justify their participation, you have to have a way of figuring out how valuable that call is to your business, and then also tying that back into the amount of time that that person has spent on the phone as part of your contact center sort of workflow. It's quite interesting to think about how you're going to measure people who aren't contact center agents and work that out from a company perspective. And thinking about that in more technical terms, obviously we have to be able to identify and define presence. So, is the person online? How are they managing their day? We have to be able to think about how that customer interaction is being stored, protected, how much data is being shared with that non-contact center agent. We have to think about how we're going to make good call quality and good connection to make sure that it doesn't become a nightmare experience where the customer is trying to talk and the agent in the field maybe can't hear them. Obviously, there's compliance and there's measurement and analytics. There's a lot of other things that go into that sort of deployment that make it an interesting use case from a technical perspective as well. So I've put on the screen that I think the only way really to solve these sorts of problems is with tight integration across UCaaS, CCaaS, and telephony. And I think that's true, and in keeping with the theme of today, is that we're talking really about reaching beyond the contact center to find these relevant use cases and then give them information from the contact center ecosystem, but also get enough information about their current workflow to identify and utilize them within a CCaaS workflow. And how do you do that without, for example, reaching into Microsoft Teams, understanding that someone is online and available, not in meetings, serving up some information to them through that collaboration platform, saying, hey, you're going to be invited on a call in a minute. Here's the background of the call. Are you ready and happy to join, right? And then you're talking about a non-disruptive workflow where within the collaboration platform, your expert has been identified, they've been reached out to, and then they're brought into a call via the collaboration platform they work in. But that requires tight integration between those platforms. And when I was doing this slide, I said, if you can think about where your SM subject matter expert is, right? And if they're within the CCaaS platform, great, easy, just dial them up. If they're within a collaboration platform, you can reach them with a collaboration integration. And then if they're anywhere else, and I've kind of put it beyond the collaboration platforms, but it could be through a different workflow or through a different app, you do kind of need a phone line to reach them. And really what that looks like is talking about guaranteeing different types of availability, guaranteeing that when that agent is in the field or on the road or somewhere else, that you can actually get through to them on the phone, and a consistency of service. And I think that's where these use cases start to get interesting, because it's not just about providing a unique instance of something happening where someone needs support. It's about building these infrastructures to enable subject matter experts to participate in CCaaS calls consistently, regardless of location, regardless of the use case that they're already engaged in. Find where they are, find if they're available, and then find a way to reach them. And the platform really shouldn't matter, because we can build an integration that will flow to the point where the subject matter expert is. And I imagine we'll talk about that a bit on the panel. I wanted to put some numbers up there. I know you guys love Cavell research, and I think this is kind of highlighting the growing appetite and demand for this. So this year we modeled how many contact center agents we think have an active Microsoft Teams integration at the moment. And you'll see that as of 2025, we think 300,000 or so have, and then by 2029, we think that will rise up to over 600,000. Now, obviously, you've heard today the size of the Microsoft Teams ecosystem. You've heard the size of the Microsoft telephony ecosystem. So this is another small aspect to that ecosystem, kind of nestled inside it, where there is a growing number of companies who are not just saying, look, I want Microsoft Teams or I want enablement. I actually need an integration between Microsoft Teams and my contact center platform to enable reaching other entities outside my contact center. So again, going back to our agent survey, I think this stat is really telling. So we asked them, you've had a lot of AI deployed at your company, what has been the thing that helps your job the most out of all the systems you've been deployed? And 1/3 of them said, actually, predictive routing is the system that has made my job easier so far. Now, we didn't quantify this. Very hard when you're doing market surveying to quantify like a level of technical complexity or that kind of thing. So this could be a simple predictive routing system. But the fact is that agents are kind of feeding back that if you serve me the right kind of calls more regularly, and you've deployed a system that can tell, if this call should go to me or someone else, that's going to be the thing that makes my job the easiest. And I think that's really telling. And then tying into that notion of we need to follow this data through as well, I think I'll end with this stat, which just, the biggest concern of contact centers this year was security of customer data. And everything I've talked about, these integrations, data must flow, we need to be able to bring people who aren't on the CCaaS ecosystem into the ecosystem. And all of those things, they are still inherently dependent on keeping that customer data secure, tracked, understanding who has access, where it's going, how it's managed. So as we think about this, we need these integrations to enable the automated use cases that we want. We need to bring more people into the contact center to solve customer queries more intelligently, efficiently. We need intelligent routing. We need all these data-powered use cases where we gather all this customer data and we understand how it works and we use it better. We can't lose sight of, at the top of that, make sure the customer data is secure and make sure that it kind of follows us through. And then obviously, just under it, don't spend too much money either. So where does that leave us before we move on to our panel? So I think, hopefully I've convinced you that CCaaS must reach people who aren't in the contact center. If I haven't, come talk to me afterwards. I'm sure I can do again. I'll give it another try. I personally believe that CCaaS needs to own the conversational data set. Now, I am a little biased as a CCaaS analyst, but the only way to secure it and to understand full governance of the customer data is for it to have a solid owner. And I think the conversational data will be gathered by the CCaaS platform and probably should be owned and orchestrated and managed by it. And the other thing just to think about is that if we're taking this CX approach, integrating telephony in, it is rapidly growing from something that is nice to have to really a core part of strategy. Because everything I've talked about on here in terms of bringing external agents in, subject matter experts dialing in, using data better, all of these things they're all use cases that will fundamentally change how these contact centers operate in different ways. If you can bring a subject matter expert in, you don't need as much time to solve a specialist query. So these things are becoming very strategic decisions in the customer experience landscape rather than just nice to haves.